It wasn't like it was a fight on the street. It was more of a fight till somebody died.
A fight with their mother after waking up late for school.
She just started waving the pot around and things like that or whatever. And so I guess she trying to hit us with the pot. You know, she just threatening us and everything.
The girls say they got the pot away from her, but it was the start of an all-out brawl.
Your mom's yelling?
We all yelling.
Everybody's yelling.
We mad.
I had took the pot from her. This one she had grabbed and kind of turned like you said, get back. But she didn't keep the knife in her hand.
My mom is winning that battle with the knife or whatever, so I picked up the pot and I hit her with the pot.
Mirror image. They were born on the same day, at the same hour, with matching features and a bond that could not be broken until it was. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead were mirror twins, a rare kind of identical twin where one is the physical reflection of the other. In their early childhood, this reflected more than their physical features. It reflected their emotions, their likes and dislikes, and their instinct to protect each other at all costs. Growing up in Conyers, Georgia, the girls were the center of attention. From the outside, they were polite, well-dressed, and bright students. They lived primarily with their great-grandmother and maternal aunt, who doted on them. Their biological mother, Charmeka Nikki Whitehead, was not a regular figure in their lives during the early years. Nikki had the twins when she was only 17 years old. Her own maturity and stability were in question, and the court decided early on that the twins were better off in the care of other family members. Nikki, however, wanted to reclaim her daughters. By the time the girls were 13, Nikki had improved her life at least on the surface. She was attending cosmetology school, living in a tidy home, and striving to be a responsible mother. She lobbied the court to regain custody of the twins, who by then had grown used to life without her. To them, Nikki wasn't a mother in the traditional sense. She was more like a distant relative suddenly stepping in with strict rules and expectations. This change sparked a conflict that would fester and deepen. The twins resented being uprooted from the home they had known all their lives. They saw Nikki as a stranger, someone who now imposed rules, curfews, and disciplined things they hadn't been used to. Arguments erupted frequently in the new household. Police were called more than once to de-escalate domestic disputes between mother and daughters. These confrontations were not one-sided. Neighbors reported hearing screaming matches, things breaking, and even witnessed the girls leaving the house, visibly upset. At school, the girls kept up appearances. They were members of the honor society and had friends who described them as funny, charismatic, and popular. But their home life was a growing pressure cooker. Friends and school counselors began noticing signs of trouble. The girls sometimes had visible scratches and bruises, and their demeanor shifted from confident to withdrawn. Nikki, for her part, told friends that her daughters were out of control and that she feared them. Still, few could have imagined what was coming. In the months leading up to the tragedy, the emotional turbulence in the Whitehead home intensified. Nikki reached out to law enforcement and family court. In one report, she expressed fear that her daughters would hurt her. The twins, in turn, told school counselors that their mother was abusive. A complicated, dangerous triangle of accusations had formed, each party blaming the other, each believing themselves to be the victim. The final act of violence would leave the community shocked and searching for answers. On January 13, 2010, everything would unravel in a way that few could believe. But to understand that day, one must first understand the years of tension, the psychological toll of familial conflict, and the way the once close bond between a mother and her daughters had curdled into fear, resentment, and ultimately fatal rage. Cracks in the glass. Conyers, Georgia, was not the kind of place where you expected violent crime. A modest suburb located just outside of Atlanta, it was better known for its quiet neighborhoods and family-friendly atmosphere than for domestic drama or police tape. That's what made the Whitehead case all the more shocking. The outward picture of the family never quite matched the chaos within. By 2009, Nikki Whitehead had been officially awarded custody of her twin daughters. It was a hard-fought legal battle. Nikki believed that regaining her children would be the final chapter of her redemption arc away, to show everyone that she had turned her life around and could provide a stable home. But her daughters didn't see it that way. To them, The custody ruling felt more like a prison sentence than a reunion. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah were 16 at the time, old enough to be defiant, strong enough to fight back, and angry enough to make their mother's life difficult. Resentment built quickly. The girls believed they had been yanked away from the only support system they knew, their great-grandmother, their aunt, and the consistent structure of a familiar home. In Nikki's house, there were new rules, phone curfews, mandatory chores, and sudden punishments for disrespect. For more videos like this, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. By fall of 2009, the twins were pushing back hard. Police were called to the Whitehead residence more than once. In one incident, Tasmiyah reportedly punched Nikki in the face during a dispute. In another, Jasmiyah allegedly threw a glass at her mother. The Rockdale County Juvenile Court System was aware of the mounting issues. Social workers were assigned girls, were temporarily removed from Nikki's home and placed back with their great-grandmother. But that reprieve was short-lived. In December 2009, the court ruled that the twins must return to live with Nikki. The reasons were, procedural Nikki was still their legal guardian, and there had been no definitive findings of abuse that warranted a change in custody. Yet this decision, rooted in legal precedent, ignored the emotional undercurrents bubbling just beneath the surface. It was like placing a lid back on a boiling pot. Back under Nikki's roof, the arguments resumed almost immediately. Neighbors reported hearing shouting nearly every night. In school, both girls started showing signs of distress. They no longer smiled as much. They were constantly tired. Teachers noticed that their schoolwork had begun to slip. One school counselor, Lisa Williams, later told investigators that she had growing concerns about the twins. It was like watching two kids who were slowly losing hope. She said, they loved their great-grandmother, they hated their mother, and they were stuck in a house they didn't want to be in. Yet Nikki wasn't some monstrous figure. Friends described her as someone who truly wanted to do better. She was trying to build a life. She'd enrolled in cosmetology school, worked part-time as a stylist, and had been striving to become more involved in her daughter's academic and personal lives. But the harder she tried, the more the twins resisted. Still, something darker was growing beneath the surface. The arguments were no longer just verbal, they were physical, destructive, and escalating. By the end of 2009, Nikki had told at least 2 people that she didn't feel safe in her own home. One friend recalled her saying, "They're going to hurt me one day. I know it." In early January 2010, just a week before her death, Nikki went to court again. She filed a complaint alleging that her daughters were becoming uncontrollable. She begged the judge for help, some form of intervention. According to court documents, Nikki was seeking a way to place the girls back with their great-grandmother or into some kind of youth program until tensions settled. The judge set a hearing date for later in the month, but time was running out. Friends noticed subtle signs of a storm brewing. Nikki's upbeat personality began to crack. She became more anxious, looking over her shoulder, avoiding direct questions about home life. She told a close friend, "I'm afraid to even sleep too heavy at night. I don't know what they're capable of anymore." On the outside, the girls seemed composed. They were well-dressed, courteous, and maintained their grades. But there were cracks. Jasmiyah once confided to a classmate that she wished she could just disappear. Tasmiyah told a different friend that she couldn't take another day in that house. Their social media posts became darker, more cryptic lyrics about death, control, betrayal, but no one predicted what would happen next. January 13th, 2010, started off like a regular school day. The girls were supposed to catch a ride to school, but by 10 a.m., they were already late. At 10:30, the girls ran up to a nearby police officer, panicked and crying, claiming they had come home to find their mother dead in the bathroom. What first appeared to be a tragic case of home invasion soon turned into something else, entirely something far more disturbing. The return to Nikki. The scene that greeted police on the morning of January 13th, 2010, was gruesome and chaotic. Officers from the Conyers Police Department responded to the twins, Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah, claiming they found their mother dead. When officers arrived at Appaloosa Way, they were met by a chilling sight. Nikki Whitehead, just 34 years old, was lying face down in the bathtub of her master bathroom. Blood was everywhere, smeared on the tiles, pooled around her body and splattered across the floor and walls. Her body was cold. Rigor mortis had already begun to set in. Her wrist was slashed. She had defensive wounds on her hands, bruises on her face, and blunt force trauma to her skull. It was, without question, a homicide. Detective Michael Yancey, one of the first investigators on the scene, would later recall, this wasn't a quick killing. This was personal. Someone was in a rage. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah were taken into separate police vehicles to be questioned. They repeated the same story almost verbatim. They had woken up late that morning, missed the bus, and walked to school. After realizing they were going to be very late, they decided to return home and tell their mom. When they entered the house, they said they found Nikki in the bathtub, lifeless and bloody. Officers noted the girls were visibly shaken. Both were crying, but something didn't feel right. For one, their behavior was slightly off. Though tearful, they weren't asking to see their mother. They didn't scream or beg for help. Their emotions seemed controlled, almost rehearsed. And strangely, despite the carnage of the scene, the twins didn't have any blood on them. This struck investigators as odd. If they had found Nikki's body and tried to help her or check for signs of life, surely there would be at least some trace of blood. Another detail raised eyebrows. The time, the medical examiner would later estimate that Nikki died between 7:30 and 9 a.m., a window during which the girls were supposed to be at school. Instead, they were home. A canvass of the neighborhood revealed conflicting accounts. One neighbor reported seeing the girls outside the house earlier that morning, not looking like they were headed to school. Another remembered seeing one of the twins walking alone down the street, but didn't think much of it. There was no forced entry into the home. No valuables were taken. No signs of robbery. Nothing appeared to be out of place, except for the horror in the bathroom. Forensics added another layer of complexity. Blood spatter analysis suggested that the attacker or attackers had moved through the hallway and into the bathroom. The trail of blood extended out of the bedroom and into the hole indicating Nikki had tried to flee or fight back. The scene wasn't just a murder. It was a brutal struggle. As officers processed the house, they began to form a theory that no one wanted to believe, that the girls weren't witnesses, they were suspects. But how could two honor roll students, just 16 years old, be capable of such rage? How could twins, bonded by blood and childhood, turn on the very woman who gave them life? To answer those questions, detectives went back in time. In the weeks leading up to Nikki's death, the warning signs had become louder. Records showed Nikki had contacted Rockdale County Juvenile Court multiple times. In one filing, she pleaded for help, stating her daughters had become physically violent. She said she was scared to be alone with them. Her requests, though documented, had not resulted in any immediate intervention. Police found Nikki's journal tucked away in a drawer in her bedroom. In it, she had written about her struggles with the girls. Some entries detailed physical fights, others emotional trauma. One entry, dated January 4th, just days before her death, read, "I don't know how much more I can take. They scream at me, curse at me, push me. I try to love them, but it's like they hate me. I'm scared. I keep thinking, what if they snap?" At the twin school, detectives interviewed staff and students. Counselors revealed that the girls had been sent in for emotional concerns multiple times. Tasmiyah had once told a teacher that her mother deserved what she had coming. Jasmiyah had expressed that she didn't feel safe at home, but teachers were divided. Some thought the twins were telling the truth. Others sensed that the girls were manipulative, charming when they wanted to be, evasive when pressed. By mid-January, the police had enough evidence to consider the twins not only witnesses, but primary persons of interest. However, lacking forensic evidence directly tying them to the crime and concerned about public perception of arresting two 16-year-old girls, they held off on charging them. The girls were allowed to return to their great-grandmother's home, where they had lived before moving in with Nikki. But detectives quietly kept them under surveillance. Meanwhile, the autopsy report was damning. Nikki Whitehead had been stabbed over 50 times. Her body bore deep slashes, including one that nearly severed her carotid artery. She had bruises on her arms and wrists, likely from trying to defend herself. There were also indications that she had been dragged. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of hatred, emotion, and closeness. January 13th, 2010. It was supposed to be an ordinary Wednesday morning in Conyers, Georgia. But for Nikki Whitehead, it would be her last day alive. The morning began with a storm brewing quietly under her roof. According to what investigators later pieced together from forensics, timeline analysis, and confessions, Nikki awoke early, likely around 6:30 a.m., to begin her day. The twins, who were supposed to get ready for school and catch the bus, were either already awake or lying in wait. There had been a fight the night before, one of many. Nikki had threatened to ground the girls for skipping chores and talking back. She'd reportedly taken away one of their cell phones and locked it in her bedroom. That single act may have been the final spark that ignited the coming violence. According to the confessions later obtained by police, the twins claimed that on the morning of January 13th, the confrontation began over something stupid, as Tasmiyah would later describe it: a missing hairbrush, a late alarm, harsh words. But what started as verbal bickering escalated quickly. Nikki reportedly slapped one of the girls during the shouting match. Then, it all unraveled. The girls claimed Nikki grabbed a pot from the stove, swinging it at one of them. In a rage, they retaliated first by shoving, then by punching, then by grabbing whatever they could get their hands on. What followed was nearly 10 minutes of unrelenting violence. Investigators believe Nikki fought for her life. The blood evidence showed a violent struggle that started in the kitchen, spilled into the hallway, and ended in the bathroom. She was scratched, punched, stabbed, and finally beaten into submission. Blood soaked the floor. Nikki tried to escape. Her prints were found on the bathroom doorframe, streaked in her own blood. She never made it. In the end, a vase, a steak knife were used as weapons. Nikki was dragged by her hair into the bathtub after she had already stopped breathing. She had over 80 injuries, including defensive wounds on both her forearms and hands. The attack had not been calculated, was frenzied, chaotic, and primal. The most chilling part? After the murder, the twins cleaned themselves up, changed clothes, and made a conscious decision to create an alibi. They removed their blood-soaked garments and stuffed them in a trash bag. They scrubbed their hands and arms, changed into clean school clothes, and tried to act normal. Their first move was to walk to school, but realizing how late they were, they turned back. They say their mother is dead in the bathtub. From that moment on, they entered the world as the grieving daughters of a slain mother, hiding behind a mask of shock and sorrow. But behind closed doors, investigators were already picking apart the inconsistencies. Detective Yancey interviewed both girls separately. They told the same story. They had left for school, realized they were late, came back, and found their mother. But subtle differences emerged. Jasmiyah said they left the house at 9:30. Tasmiyah said it was closer to 9 o'clock. One said Nikki had been cold to the touch. The other said she was still bleeding. Then came the forensic inconsistencies. Forensics found that Nikki had died hours earlier than when the girls claimed to have left the house. There was no sign of forced entry, no robbery. No one else seen entering or leaving the home. And most notably, there were no footprints or drag marks from any intruder. But more than that, police began looking closer at the twins themselves. Though they showed no visible injuries at first glance, a closer inspection revealed faint scratches on their arms, and one had a small bite mark on her finger, possibly from Nikki during the struggle. When questioned, both girls claimed the scratches came from their cat. Even more damning was the physical evidence found inside the house in the days that followed. Hidden under the bathroom sink was a bloody shirt. In the laundry room, detectives found a trash bag containing a pair of school shoes with trace blood spatter on the soles. Bleach containers were found out of place, and one had fingerprints matching Tasmia. The investigation now had a direction, but detectives knew they needed more. The community still largely believed the girls were innocent. News outlets covered the story as a tragedy. Twin daughters lose their mother in a savage attack. Sympathy poured in. But behind the scenes, the Rockdale County Sheriff's Office had begun building a case for murder. They conducted polygraph tests. Both girls refused. They subpoenaed school records, court documents, and phone messages. Some texts sent between the twins days before the murder hinted at their growing hatred for Nikki. Still, investigators were cautious. charging 2 underage girls for matricide in a conservative, family-oriented Georgia town would draw national attention and scrutiny. So, for the next several weeks, police waited. They followed the girls, listened, gathered evidence, and then came the break they were waiting for. In May 2010, just 4 months after Nikki's murder, Jasmiyah Whitehead cracked. During a voluntary interview, she let slip a detail that had never been released to the public. It was enough. Soon after, detectives brought both girls back in for another round of questioning, this time with a more confrontational approach. They showed photos of the scene, described the wounds, challenged the alibi. The masks began to slip, and as detectives pushed harder, the horrifying truth would begin to spill out, first in tears, then in admissions, and finally, in a full confession that would shock even seasoned officers. The scene of the crime, the Whitehead home at Appaloosa Way, was a modest house, nestled in a cul-de-sac with trimmed lawns and tidy mailboxes. On any other day, it blended in with the suburban calm of years. But on January 13, 2010, it became a crime scene. After securing the property, forensic teams began the painstaking task of collecting evidence. What they uncovered painted a gruesome and heartbreaking picture of what happened that morning, minute by minute, drop by drop. Blood evidence. Blood was the first and loudest witness. Pools of it were found in the kitchen, hallway, and master bathroom. It wasn't just in one spot. Tit was everywhere. A blood trail led from the kitchen to the master bedroom and then to the bathroom, indicating that Nikki had fought her way through the house before succumbing to her injuries. The walls in the bathroom had spatter at varying heights, which told investigators something critical. The victim had been upright, then fell to her knees, then collapsed completely. The position of the blood suggested she had tried to grab onto the edge of the tub, likely in a desperate attempt to stabilize herself. Near the sink was a broken glass vase, covered in partial fingerprints and blood. Later, DNA analysis confirmed that both girls' DNA was on the vase. Another chilling detail: bloody handprints, one of which was pressed against the tile near the door. It was Nikki's. The size and angle suggested she was trying to crawl or drag herself away. She never made it more than a few feet. The murder weapons. The murder wasn't carried out with a single weapon. It was brutal, improvised, and frenzied. 3 items were recovered: a kitchen steak knife, stained with blood and bearing partial prints, with traces of Nikki's blood; a shattered glass vase, presumed to be the first weapon used during the initial attack. Each weapon had been used with intensity and emotion. The knife wounds were clustered, indicating repeated stabbing in a concentrated area. These weren't the calculated moves of a cold-blooded killer. They were wild, angry, chaotic, driven by rage, not strategy. Signs of staging? Detectives quickly realized that the crime scene had been staged. This was not a random home invasion. The locks were undisturbed. The windows were intact. Nikki's purse sat on the kitchen counter with cash inside. Her car keys were untouched. Her phone was still charging. Nothing had been taken. But certain things had been cleaned. A bleach bottle was found under the kitchen sink, nearly empty. Its nozzle had been wiped down, but investigators recovered a latent fingerprint belonging to Tasmiyah. The smell of bleach lingered faintly throughout the hallway and bathroom, suggesting a rushed cleanup attempt. Fingerprint and DNA evidence. Most of the prints in the house belonged to Nikki and the twins. It's unsurprising, as they lived there. But certain details stood out. On the steak knife, partial prints blurred, likely from blood work consistent with both girls. Forensic experts noted that the twins likely handled the knife without gloves. There were also signs of blood transfer on the doorknob, leading out of the bathroom, not smears, but light stains that suggested someone touched it with blood on their fingers, then wiped it partially clean. The only usable print recovered from that knob belonged to Tasmiyah. That small detail would later become a turning point in building a timeline. Autopsy results. The medical examiner's findings were both graphic and heartbreaking. Nikki Whitehead had been stabbed at least 30 times. She had additional injuries to her scalp and face from blunt force trauma. Her left wrist had a deep laceration, and her right forearm was fractured, consistent with defensive wounds. Time of death was estimated between 7:30 and 9 a.m. That narrowed the window of opportunity. The girls had claimed they left for school before 9 a.m., returned at 10:30, and found Nikki dead. but the autopsy suggested Nikki was already dead before 9 a.m., meaning the twins were likely home at the time of the killing. The lack of forced entry, missing items, and third-party DNA made it clear. The killers were already inside the house. Behavioral red flags. As the investigation deepened, officers kept returning to the girls' behavior. In their initial police interviews, both girls cried, but their tears dried fast. Investigators noted that during questioning, they rarely asked questions about their mother's condition or what had happened. Instead, they focused on how long the interviews would take or when they could go home. Both girls also made strange, unsolicited comments. Jasmiyah, she's just always yelling at us, always in our faces. I knew something like this would happen. Tasmiyah, she was mean. I told people she was going to snap one day. These statements painted a clear picture. The girls were setting a tone that Nikki was the aggressor, that her death was somehow inevitable. But to police, it sounded like justification. Investigators began drawing up a psychological profile. 2 teenage girls, identical in looks and nearly indistinguishable in temperament, stuck in a volatile home, growing angrier by the day. Combine adolescent rage, emotional instability, and years of resentment and you get a pressure cooker ready to explode. What they needed now was a confession. And that confession would come not through trickery, not through false promises, but through the crushing weight of guilt. One of the girls would eventually break. And when she did, it would unravel everything. Tales begin to fracture. In the weeks after Nikki Whitehead's murder, detectives at the Rockdale County Sheriff's Office took their time. They weren't rushing toward an arrest knot without solid evidence and airtight statements. Public opinion still largely viewed the twins as victims, not suspects. But the investigative team knew what they were seeing: a staged scene, false timelines, and behavioral tells that didn't match true grief. The girls had returned to live with their great-grandmother, Della Frazier, the matriarch of the family who had raised them for most of their lives. Della, like many others, believed the twins were innocent. She had known Nikki's troubled past and accepted the girls' claims that Nikki had become abusive in the home. To Della and other relatives, the idea that the girls could kill their own mother was unimaginable. But detectives were watching. They followed the girls, monitored their movements, tapped into their phone records, watched how they behaved with friends and family. They didn't act like 2 teenagers mourning a brutal loss. In fact, their behavior was strange, especially for girls who had supposedly discovered their mother's butchered body. They went to the movies, laughed with friends, reposted memes and song lyrics on social media. They weren't crying. They weren't isolated. They were living life as if the murder never happened. Detective Michael Yancey once noted, they were acting like this wasn't the worst day of their lives. It was like it hadn't touched them. But behind the scenes, the twins were growing restless. The fear of being found out was eating away at them. And as they were brought in for follow-up interviews in the months after the killing, cracks started to form. The second round of interviews, the first interviews had been sympathetic, gently probing the girls for inconsistencies. But in the second round, especially by late spring, detectives took a different approach. They started applying pressure. Not accusatory, but persistent. Each girl was questioned separately, asked to recount the events of January 13th once again. Detectives deliberately asked them to go over small, seemingly irrelevant details. The clothes they wore, the breakfast they had, the time they left for school, what shoes Nikki had on, how the bathroom smelled. It didn't take long for the details to diverge. Jasmiyah said they had argued with Nikki the night before but went to bed peacefully. Tasmiyah said they went to bed angry and didn't speak that morning. One said they walked to school alone. The other said they walked part of the way together, then separated. Jasmiyah said she didn't remember seeing blood until she entered the bathroom. Tasmiyah claimed the blood was in the hallway too. The inconsistencies were subtle but vital. They revealed that the story wasn't rehearsed well enough to hold up under pressure. Detectives took notes, compared responses, and continued pulling at threads. In one pivotal interview, Tasmiyah, when shown photographs of the crime scene, let out a quiet "Oh God" and turned away. Detectives noted her hands shook slightly. When asked if she wanted to confess to anything, she remained silent. They could see the pressure mounting. The third interview, breaking point. It was May 2010, nearly 5 months after the murder, when detectives finally got what they were waiting for. They invited Jasmiyah back for one more interview. This time, it would change everything. They didn't accuse her. They didn't show her the evidence. They simply sat with her and let silence do the work. The lead detective asked Jas, "Is there anything you want to tell us? Anything at all?" She shook her head, but her body language betrayed her. She kept her arms wrapped around herself, eyes darting to the floor, biting her lip. Then came the moment of truth. The detective leaned forward and said, "The blood tells a story. It tells us someone was there, and we know it was you. We know you were involved." Jasmiyah's eyes welled up. She didn't speak for nearly a minute, and then she whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." It was the first crack in the dam. Once she started, the words poured out. She described the months of tension in the house, the arguments, the feeling of being trapped, the night before the murder, the way Nikki had taken away her phone and screamed at her. She said she hated her mother but didn't want her dead. She claimed she was scared, claimed Nikki attacked first, claimed she was trying to stop the fight, but detectives knew that wasn't true. The sheer brutality of the scene didn't align with self-defense. Still, her partial confession was enough to pull the thread. The arrests? On May 21st, 2010, both Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead were arrested and charged with the murder of their mother. The news shook the entire community. 2 girls, honors students, once seen as victims, were now being paraded out of the sheriff's office in handcuffs. Mugshots replaced school portraits. National media pounced on the story. Wynn sisters accused of the charges were heavy: malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. Because they were 16 at the time of the crime, they were charged as adults. Family members were devastated. Some refused to believe the news. Others, who had seen the storm building, were not surprised. The twins were placed in separate juvenile detention facilities to await trial. For the first time in their lives, they were separated. It was a strategic move. Detectives knew that the psychological bond between the girls was powerful, but it could also be used as leverage. Separated and isolated, one or both might be more willing to talk, more willing to confess, more willing to take a plea. But while the arrests brought temporary closure, the case was far from over. There were court battles ahead, legal arguments, media spectacles, and eventually to full confessions that would finally expose the twisted, violent final moments of Nikki Whitehead's life. Interrogation tactics. When the handcuffs clicked shut on Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead in May 2010, the twins' lives changed forever. No longer seen as victims of a home invasion or daughters in mourning, they were now defendants in a chilling case of matricide young girls accused of stabbing and beating their own mother to death in a violent rage. For months, the case had quietly progressed under the radar. But now, with the twins in custody, it would unfold on a larger stage. The media caught on, public fascination surged, and pressure on prosecutors to secure a conviction intensified. Behind closed doors, investigators and prosecutors knew the key to this case wasn't just the forensic evidence, it was the confessions, and the girls were already starting to talk. Isolation and strategy. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah had never been apart for long. They were close twins, inseparable for most of their lives. But after their arrest, the state made the deliberate decision to separate them into different detention centers. It was a classic psychological move. Each girl would now have to sit alone, wonder what the other was saying, and live in the fear that one twin might turn on the other. Without their usual emotional safety net, the walls could come crashing down. Interrogators knew that time, isolation, and guilt could break through where confrontation alone could not. Each girl was approached delicately, interviewed multiple times over several months. No harsh tactics, no yelling, no threats. Instead, officers used empathy, patience, and silence. They allowed the weight of the moment to settle in. Tasmiyah was the quieter of the two, more reserved, harder to read. She sat stiffly in her chair during interviews, offering minimal responses, rarely making eye contact. She clung to the claim that she had been asleep during the murder and had nothing to do with it. Jasmiyah, on the other hand, was cracking. Slowly, her earlier half-confession had opened the door. Now prosecutors and detectives wanted the rest, the full confession, in a taped confession that would later become public. Jasmiyah detailed what had happened on the morning of January 13, 2010. She told detectives about the fight, the screaming, the moment things spiraled out of control. "It just happened so fast," she said. "We didn't go there to kill her." According to her, it started with an argument over discipline. Nikki had taken away their phones. She was angry that the girls were late for school again. Words were exchanged. Threats, too. Then pushing. Jasmiyah claimed Nikki hit her first, that she grabbed a pot from the stove to defend herself, that Tasmiyah stepped in, then fists were flying, hair pulling. One of them grabbed a vase, another got a steak knife. "We kept hitting her. I think she bit me. I don't know, I just kept hitting her. Then Taz hit her too. We didn't plan it. I swear we didn't." She began to cry as she spoke, but there was no stopping now. The full horror of that morning spilled out. She described chasing Nikki through the house, Nikki trying to flee, bleeding, begging, screaming for them to stop, but they didn't. By the end, Nikki Whitehead had been stabbed over 50 times, bludgeoned and bitten. The coroner would later confirm that she died from blunt force trauma to the head and multiple stab wounds. After the killing, the girls panicked. They cleaned up the blood, staged the scene to look like a robbery, and went to school late, trying to act normal. It was a poorly constructed cover-up, but at 16 years old, they were in survival mode. Detectives listened quietly. They didn't interrupt. They didn't press. They knew this was Golda, full confession with brutal detail. But the job wasn't finished. They still needed Tasmiyah. Breaking Tasmiyah. Unlike her sister, Tasmiyah held firm for months. Even after being told that her twin had confessed, she remained stoic, silent. In her mind, she was stronger, more disciplined, maybe even smarter. If she stayed quiet, maybe she could walk away from this. But the confession tapes spoke louder than any denial. Eventually, her attorney advised her to cooperate. The evidence was overwhelming. Jasmiyah had implicated them both. Blood evidence, text records, and autopsy reports corroborated the confession. With no way out, Tasmiyah finally confessed. Her story matched her sister's, almost word for word. She described how Nikki had tried to assert her authority over the man, how they snapped. She admitted to striking her mother with a vase, stabbing her, biting her when Nikki tried to grab the knife away. The rage that had been building for years exploded in one terrible morning. She said, "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." No matter how many times she said it, though it didn't change the result. The public learns the truth. In 2011, Rockdale County prosecutors prepared to go to trial. But with 2 full-taped confessions, they held the cards. The defense had little to work with. There were no claims of self-defense left to make, no mental health angles strong enough to win sympathy from a jury. Some viewed the girls as cold-blooded killers. Others, especially those familiar with the long custody dispute and Nikki's parenting struggles, believed the system had failed all 3 of them. Even within the family, the response was split. Some relatives sided with the girls, blaming the courts for forcing them back into Nikki's custody after years of living safely with their great-grandmother. But for law enforcement, one thing was clear. Nothing could justify what had been done. The court would soon have its say, and the twins, no longer protected by youth, denial, or silence, would finally face the consequences, facing justice. With their confessions on record and the evidence neatly aligned, the case of Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead moved out of the realm of mystery and into the machinery of justice. The Rockdale County District Attorney's office no longer needed to prove motive or reconstruct the timeline. The twins had laid it all out themselves, but the case was still complicated. The girls were juveniles, just 16 at the time of the murder. Yet the brutality of the crime, the age of the victim, and the national attention made it almost impossible for prosecutors to treat it as anything less than first-degree murder. The courtroom would now become the final arena for the unraveling of this tragic story. Juveniles charged as adults. In May 2010, shortly after their confessions, the court made the decision. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah would be tried as adults. This move sparked both approval and outrage. Some believed that anyone capable of committing such a violent act regardless of age should be tried accordingly. Others argued that the girls had been abused, manipulated by a broken custody system, and lacked the mental maturity to fully comprehend their actions. But in Georgia, the law was clear. Murder committed by individuals as young as 13 could be tried in adult court. And in this case, the prosecution wasn't backing down. A grand jury indicted the twins on multiple charges, including malice, murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, possession of a knife during the commission of a crime. With trial preparations underway, both girls were held in Rockdale County Jail, sharp contrast from the juvenile facilities they had known. Gone were the counseling sessions and group therapy. Gone was the hope of early intervention. Now it was just concrete walls, barred windows, and the looming specter of life in prison. A strategic move. Plea negotiations. As the trial date approached in 2012, both defense teams knew the risks of going before a jury. The confessions were irrefutable, the evidence overwhelming. A conviction on first-degree murder could result in life without parole, even for minors. The prosecution, aware of the potential challenges of trying juveniles, especially twin sisters with a sympathetic backstory, was open to negotiation. In the spring of 2014, 4 years after the murderer deal was reached, both Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah agreed to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter as part of a negotiated plea agreement. In exchange, the charges of malice murder were dropped. Each girl would serve 30 years in prison, with 15 years to be served in custody and the remainder on parole. They would be eligible for release in their early 30s. The plea agreement shocked some. How could a savage killing like this result in just 15 years behind bars? But for prosecutors, it guaranteed a conviction, protected the integrity of the case, and spared the community the trauma of a public trial. The Whitehead family, deeply divided, had mixed reactions. Some were relieved that the legal process was over. Others were angry, calling the sentence too lenient for the horrific crime. Still others viewed it as justice tempered with mercy and acknowledgement. That this case was as much about a system that failed a family as it was about the girl's choices. The sentencing hearing, on May 21, 2014, inside a crowded Rockdale County courtroom. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah stood side by side as they were sentenced. For the first time in years, the sisters were together again, but not as free young women, as convicted killers. They wore orange prison jumpsuits. Their once vibrant personalities had dulled. They spoke only when addressed, their voices barely audible. Judge David Irwin read the sentence aloud and acknowledged the unique tragedy of the case. This is one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking cases this county has ever seen. There are no winners, here are only layers of loss. In their statements to the court, both girls apologized. Jasmiyah, the more emotional of the two, cried as she said, "We loved our mom. We didn't mean for it to go that far. We just wanted her to stop. I'm sorry for everything." Tasmiyah was more reserved. "I regret what happened every day. I think about it all the time. I wish we could take it back." But the apologies, while perhaps sincere, were met with skepticism by some in the gallery. The brutality of the murder still loomed large. After the sentencing, both girls were taken back to separate prison facilities to begin their 15-year terms. Aftermath in Rockdale County, the conclusion of the case did not bring peace to the community. In many ways, it left more questions than answers. Could this tragedy have been prevented if the courts had listened to Nikki's mother and kept the girls in her custody? Was the conflict between Nikki and her daughters truly escalating, or had it been misrepresented in the media? Were the girls remorseful, or simply remorseful they had been caught? Psychologists and sociologists began citing the Whitehead case as a textbook failure of family court, juvenile services, and mental health intervention. Local schools began investing more heavily in conflict resolution programs and family counseling services. Child Protective Services reviewed its guidelines, but the changes came too late to save Nikki or the futures her daughters once had. The girls behind bars, as Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah adjusted to prison life, they were separated indefinitely. The Department of Corrections deliberately placed them in different facilities to prevent collusion, fights, or codependence. Each twin had to learn to survive without the other, a painful twist of fate for two girls who once did everything together. Despite the distance, both girls reportedly expressed interest in rehabilitation, participating in educational programs, group therapy and counseling. But there would be no reunion, no shared cells, and no public sympathy. They were serving time as adults for one of the most disturbing crimes in the county's history, the long silence. After their sentencing in 2014, Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead disappeared from the headlines just as quickly as they had entered them. With their trial avoided and prison sentences set, there was little left for the media to cover. The public, once captivated by the horrific nature of the crime and the shocking reality of twin daughters murdering their mother, moved on. But inside the concrete walls of the Georgia Department of Corrections, time didn't move. On it slowed down. The long silence began. Twin lives, separate paths. Though they had grown up nearly inseparable, prison life forced Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah into radically different environments. Jasmiyah was sent to Pulaski State Prison, a medium security facility for women in Hawkinsville, Georgia. It was known for its educational programming and inmate rehabilitation services, but it was still prison. Razor wire, locked doors, and the never-ending monotony of a life reduced to counts and corrections officers. Tasmiyah, on the other hand, was housed at Lee Arrendale State Prison, one of Georgia's largest women's facilities. Unlike Pulaski, Lee Arrendale had a reputation for tougher inmate culture and more restricted movement, though the two occasionally exchanged brief letters through legal channels or family intermediaries. Their direct communication was prohibited. Georgia's policy forbade inmates from corresponding with each other without administrative permission, and in the case of the Whitehead twins, that permission was never granted. The state had its reasons. The sisters were considered high-risk young, manipulative, and once capable of planning and carrying out a murder together. Now, the system kept them apart. The weight of isolation, separated from her sister and burdened with the trauma of the crime, Jasmiyah reportedly struggled early in her incarceration. Sources close to prison staff would later say she experienced panic attacks, depressive episodes, and nightmares, often waking up crying. She frequently requested to speak to prison counselors, who noted her behavior as distressed but cooperative. Tasmiyah, meanwhile, adopted a different coping mechanism: silence and withdrawal. She kept her head down, stayed out of fights, and immersed herself in GED prep classes and library work. A staff psychologist at Lee Arrendale would later write in her file, "Subject appears emotionally detached but not violent. Shows a tendency toward internalization of trauma and rarely exhibits outward emotion." Both sisters, in their own way, were still processing the enormity of what they had done. Public curiosity and true crime culture. Despite their silence, the world outside hadn't completely forgotten the Whitehead twins. In 2015, TV1's Fatal Attraction aired a 1-hour special on the case, titled Twisted Twins. It chronicled the murder, the investigation, and the plea deal. The show included real interrogation footage of Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah, their interviews laced with nervous laughter, tears, and inconsistencies that eventually cracked under pressure. The public watched in disbelief. Viewers were shocked at how composed, even childlike, the girls seemed. The juxtaposition between their innocent appearance and the brutal reality of the crime only deepened public fascination. In 2017, Oxygen snapped. Killer Couples featured a longer segment on the twins. By now, they had become icons in the true crime world, symbols of a rare phenomenon: sibling match. Documentaries, podcasts, YouTube breakdowns, all fueled speculation about motive, psychology, and blame. Were the twins monsters or victims themselves? Was the murder premeditated or a case of emotional explosion? And how did two bright, promising girls end up drenched in their mother's blood? Though neither sister had made public statements since their sentencing, their case lived on in true crime culture, dissected and debated by millions. Family in the shadows. Outside of prison, the Whitehead family remained fractured. Della Frazier maintained a quiet dignity throughout the process. She retreated from public interviews. Friends say she never stopped mourning, never stopped replaying the what-ifs. What if the girls had stayed with her? What if she had fought harder to block the custody order? What if anyone had listened? Della visited the girls a handful of times during their early incarceration, hoping to find signs of remorse or redemption. She reportedly told a friend, "They were broken when they came back to Nikki, and nobody fixed them." Extended relatives were divided. Some publicly supported the girls, citing the alleged dysfunction in Nikki's home and the volatility of the relationship. Others cut off all contact, branding the twins as ungrateful and dangerous. The family unit that had once been torn apart by custody battles was now broken beyond repair. Attempts at rehabilitation. By 2019, both Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah had taken steps to rehabilitate themselves. Jasmiyah earned her GED and enrolled in early college correspondence courses. She joined a prison peer support group and worked as an assistant in the prison chapel. Fellow inmates described her as polite, quiet, and deeply reflective. Tasmiyah participated in mental health workshops. She, too, completed a GED writing program that circulated anonymously through a nonprofit. An excerpt, reportedly written by Tasmiyah, read, "People think we're evil, that we're monsters. I'm not saying what we did was right, but I know pain, I know fear, I know what it feels like to be trapped, and I've paid for it every single day since." While the state didn't permit direct interviews, both sisters were said to be undergoing regular therapy and showing signs of emotional growth. Still, some critics argued that no amount of time or counseling could undo the sheer brutality of Nikki Whitehead's death, waiting for the world beyond the walls. As the years went by, the countdown began. Both sisters, having served a portion of their 30-year sentence, would become eligible for parole around 2029. By then, they'd be in their early 30s, the same age their mother was when she died. Would the parole board grant them a second chance? Would they be released quietly, or face the glare of media attention all over again? And if they were released, what life could they possibly build? The long silence would eventually end, but for now, the twins waited. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead, once vibrant and full of potential, now spent their days behind locked doors, slowly aging through their sentence, haunted by the ghost of the woman who gave them life and whom they took away. Reflections and reckonings. The story of Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead is one that continues to disturb, perplex, and haunt anyone who encounters it. As the years pass following their conviction, the questions surrounding the tragedy did not fade. They only deepened. The brutality of the crime, the slashing, the beating, the raw rage was chilling. But the identity of the perpetrators is what kept the world transfixed. Twin daughters, teenagers, a mirror image of innocence turned violent. What drove them to murder? What role did upbringing, trauma, and environment play? And what does justice really look like when the guilty are also victims in their own way? Years later, emotional fallout. In the years following their sentencing, prison staff, court psychologists, and those who interacted with the twins began to share insights into their emotional evolution. Jasmiyah reportedly became more spiritually grounded. She participated in religious services and expressed a desire to become a counselor if ever released. Tasmiyah, still quieter, expressed herself through writing and began contributing anonymously to a journal circulated among incarcerated women in Georgia. An entry dated 2023, widely believed to be hers, read, "You can't unkill someone. You can't rewind time. I see her in my dreams. Sometimes she's screaming. Sometimes she's holding me. I don't know which version is worse. They both had regrets, but neither could turn back the clock. The clock they destroyed when they stole their mother's final minutes." Public opinion, divided and unsettled. Even years after the crime, the public remained split. Some believed the girls were monsters in disguise, calculating killers who deserved every year of their sentence. Others saw them as products of a toxic home and failed system, crying out for help in the worst possible way. Critics pointed to the juvenile justice reform movement, arguing that cases like the Whitehead twins challenged our assumptions about youth, culpability, and rehabilitation. Should teenagers be sentenced to decades in prison? Can people who commit horrific acts at 16 be redeemed by 30? Do Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah deserve forgiveness? These were the questions debated in courtrooms, classrooms, and online forums for years. Inside the mind, trauma, and tragedy. Court-appointed psychologists who interviewed the twins after their arrest described complex trauma profiles. The twins had endured years of emotional instability and parental absence. They lived under dual authority structures, being bounced between their great-grandmother's stable home and their mother's volatile environment. They had never learned emotional regulation, only emotional survival. The psychologist reported, what emerged was a perfect storm: unresolved anger, fear of abandonment, a desperate desire for control, and adolescent impulsivity. They snapped, but that break was years in the making. The story, then, wasn't only about one terrible morning in January 2010, it was about everything that led to it. Parole on the horizon. Both Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead will be eligible for parole in the late 2020s. Their behavior in prison, largely compliant and remorseful, will weigh in their favor. But so will the severity of the crime. By the time their parole hearings approach, they will have spent nearly 2 decades behind bars. The world outside will have changed dramatically. They will emerge as adults in their 30s, having never experienced adult freedom. Family members, including Della Frazier, are reportedly undecided about whether they will oppose parole or remain silent. One anonymous source close to the family stated, Della believes in second chances, but she also believes in consequences. Lessons from a fractured family. The story of the Whitehead twins is more than a headline, it is a case study in broken systems. A legal system that failed to assess the emotional maturity of 2 vulnerable girls. A child welfare system that allowed a vicious custody to guvor to fester unchecked. A mental health crisis that went ignored until it turned fatal. At its core, this story is about a family at war with itself, with no winner at the end. Jarmeka Nikki Whitehead is gone. Her daughters are in prison. The community they once lived in Conyers, Georgia, still bears the shadow of their story. The final reckoning. Whether or not the Whitehead twins are ever released, their story will endure as a chilling reminder of what happens when warning signs are ignored, when pain is allowed to rot in silence, and when violence becomes the final word in a family's argument. If and when they walk free, the world will have a choice. Will we welcome them back as women who paid their debt and grew beyond their darkest hour? Or will we forever define them by the blood-stained uniforms they once wore? Only time and truth can answer that.